Hello people of the internet, welcome to the Painting with Commentary for episode 30 of Paint to Life, the Nolzur's Marvelous Miniatures Ogre Zombie. So right out the gate here we have a zombie. Here's the art from the Monsters Manual. Looks pretty cool, but see those guts hanging out? That gave me an idea. Even though the mini has a cool ripped open abdomen, I'm going to go a little bit different. So I start with my handy Dremel tool, which is like a drill but a handheld, and I'm going to punch in his eye socket with this little bit, which is just a triangular bit, nice and easy. Punch his eye in. And then I'm going to also bore a hole in his guts, not all the way through. I mean, you could do it all the way through, but I like the idea of like this cavity. So just go gentle. Now, interesting fun fact here. Watch me working on his guts here and see the Dremel. It's going to start to hit his thumb. See his thumb there? I was kind of careless and I actually burned the thumb off, which you'll see in a second. So now I'm just going to use my XACTO knife and scalp him. I'm taking the skull down a bit with a little sharpening. You be careful, wear gloves if you're not super careful, but I'm basically just pulling the skin back around from his face to expose some of that skull, which is going to be a cool effect that we're going to play later on. Rather than just have an open eye socket, we're going to have an entirely exposed skull. So now I'm cleaning out this abdomen hole I just told you guys about. Again, some of these minis are hollow in spots, so it worked out really well. I was able to paint some of the remaining thing to look like a spine. Very cool. So I've made a little customization to make this miniature a unique, one of a kind in my own. So a little bit of trim and mop work. Now notice this interesting fact. See how his thumb is missing? When I went to look at it later, where's his thumb? Well, the rotary the Dremel had been rubbing against it while I was working on his guts. So I got out some green stuff and I molded him a new thumb to replace the one that I had buzzed off. So in case you wonder why you'll see a green thumb coming up, that's why. So now that our drill work is done, we're going to start to paint. So I use a KISLEV flesh as my base coat. And if you watch the episode 30 of Paint to Life, you realize this zombie isn't your state-of-the-art, run-of-the-mill, zombie raised from the dead brains. I mean, this story about Gul-Kot, he is an actual ogre cursed with ever-ending life. So I didn't want to do him gray and green and putrefied like a zombie would be. No, he just died recently. He continues to die. The injuries he sustains while he's in this permanent life curse don't heal. So let's start by painting this ogre zombie like an ogre, with a nice base coat of flesh layered up with some lighter tone and some darker tone, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. So the first part is KISLEV flesh. It's a nice fleshy undertone for what's to come. So I'm getting some more on here, and I'm just thinking about what else I was thinking about at this time. Again, I kind of glazed over it quickly earlier, but if you're going to use a Dremel, make sure you use eye protection, and if you're going to use the XACTO knife, make sure you have gloves on or just very careful making those cuts, especially when those blades are real sharp. You just don't want it to come up on you and cut you. It'd be a very embarrassing accident to try and explain to someone how it happened. So you can see this paint is going over that green thumb. Haha, no pun intended. There was also a bandage that was draped from that hand that I tried to resculpt. You can see there's one on his right hand. It hangs down there, but the one on his left, I wasn't successful with the green stuff to make a drooping bandage, so I just had to go without. And again, that just happened while I was using the Dremel in that abdomen hole, which you see there. The chuck part that spins on the drill was rubbing against his finger and it just burned that right off. So something to consider if you're using power tools with minis. So RAKARTH flesh is the layer or the highlight color I chose to use. Again, all of this is going to kind of be for naught by the time the whole thing is said and done with the contrast paint shade I decided to use. And I did this color to try and make him look pale, that he had possibly been growing pale and turning dead and losing his blood. It works pretty well, but like I said, ultimately when those contrast paints go on later for color and shading, it kind of blends it all together. But I sometimes wonder if I didn't do this, if it would look a little bit more flat than because I did. So now that that's done, we're on to the Night Quester flesh. So I had this idea, as I've said, the shit's been kicked out of him and he's not healing. So this Night Quester flesh is the first part of my bruises that I'm going to apply. So I paint them on his lower back, upper back, biceps, under his calves and thighs. Imagine you get smashed with a baseball bat. Imagine the bruise you would get all around the gore hole there. So this is just a darker flesh tone, so that once I apply the bruising effect, it will blend nicely. So I did some research. I got this video, not a video, I got it off Google Images. Here's a picture of a wicked bruise. Like, see that bruising? The different colors of purple and flesh tone, as well as pinks. So I used that as kind of my reference of what a bruise would look like. So hence the Night Quester flesh went down first to represent the areas that I was gonna bruise, and then out comes the purple. Now the purple is quite a loud purple, and I was a little worried at first when I did it. I'm like, oh Jesus, I just totally wrecked it. But once the rest of the colors blended into it and the contrast paint that I used, I think I liked the bruising. It was probably my favorite part of this miniature, to be honest, other than the gore. And Naggaroth Knight, now this is a darker purple, as you can see. See, as they're all stacked up, the Knight plus the Xereuses or whichever, and then the Naggaroth, they kind of blend nicely to look like a pool of blood that's not healing. So now some Screaming Skull on that exposed skull, as well as his eye socket. This is his bone. You can see the line where it met his face and took his nose and have a good seam there. And I used the Dremel to get in there a good 1/16 of an inch, so it's deep enough that it's noticeable. So pink horror on the cool muscles. So the designers of this mini left some cool gashes and exposed abdomen muscles. They look really sick, especially when the contrast paints get in there. I think this mini, which by the way, this was one of the painting minis. What the hell are they called? You know, like paint nights? That's right. Like the Manticore. So not in Canada or outside of the US, but for you guys might be painting this as part of the paint night kit. The mini itself is great. You don't even need to customize it. They did a great job. So I put some pink horror on all the gory bits that came out of the box. The gash in his shoulder, in his left shoulder there, the gash on his abs, yes. Mournfang brown, just a little bit here for his mutton chops, for his hair, which I specifically didn't touch when I was working on his skull because I wanted him to have it. And GORTHOR brown for his fur. Now I knew this fur was going to become a mess. I mean, you got a guy who's wearing this fur, which is probably already filthy, but add on top of that the fact that he's bleeding and fluids and drainage and pus and all that nasty stuff is going on to it. So put this quick layer down for the furs, and I'm going to go back over it a bunch of different times from a bunch of different colors and angles. But you know, since we have some time before the next segue, I'd say this, you know, I again, just when you paint these things, when I paint these things, just enjoy the ride. I'm telling a story. Those bruises on his back, how did he get those bruises? Look at the mace that hit that. What happened to his stomach? Why did he get that big hole there? And of course, as you see in the episode, it was a dwarven ballista that shot him right in the stomach. He pulls the bolt out, removing entrails with it. Like, this is the whole concept with miniature painting when they say paint to life. While I'm painting this, I'm not just making colors or like a coloring book. I'm actually, every one of these licks, these wounds, these colors tells me a story. What color? So this brown. So what is this fur even made of? It's probably like, it lives in the plains in silver, so it's probably from a bear. You know what I mean? And the more you put into that while you're painting it, the more you'll bond with the miniature, and it'll be one of a kind for you. And it absolutely makes the hobby, well, at least for me, that much more enjoyable. So that's something to consider while you're painting. Try not to think of it as a hobby, as a chore. Try to think of it as something exciting to learn. Now, Gray Seer, he had all these bandages on his arms, and I'm going to paint them gray, which is probably could have just left the primer, because it's almost, the Gray Seer is almost the same color as the Vallejo gray that these things come pre-primed with. But I did know that I was going to be doing some paint on top of them with contrast, and I, just in case the Vallejo gray primer doesn't hold up as well as a straight up Citadel, I'm sure this Gray Seer is slightly more white than the Vallejo primer. So had no problem hitting all these bandages with that color to get them ready for some treatment later. So next up we have Steel Legion Drab. This is going on the handle of that club, which ultimately when I dry brushed it, it gets to have a very stony look. I know that the ogres use a lot of stone weapons or natural weapons, so instead of doing a metallic mace that's a big head of metal, I painted it gray and then dry brushed it to look like a stone mace. There it is. Here comes the Dawnstone I was just talking about. Dawnstone goes on, and we'll dry brush it coming up. You can see all those bruises, they're drying in various interesting patterns. They look like islands in an ocean of flesh. And ultimately, once I put the bloody paint on, the pink contrast paint, it really brings out the deep in the purple and hides those transition lines. It's quite amazing. Like I said, maybe I'm just a sucker for gore and painting gore, but I had a lot of fun. HASHUT copper, maybe one of my mistakes on this model. He's got these 5 little bands around his neck. I did them copper, but there's already so much earth tone in him with his kilt plus his skin plus the contrast I'm going to paint. I probably should have done these in silver just so they would pop off. Steel Legion Drab again. This is just for the belt. The belt is nothing exciting. I just did it as Steel Legion Drab. I think I hit it later with a layer of something, and then I even doused it with some Aggrex Earth Shade, I believe it was, for some a shade, just to get the definition, because the belt actually has 3 parts to it. So once that belt is done, we're going to take a look here at the finished prepared model. As you can see, all the base coating is done, a little bit of layering and a little bit of my work. Now it's time to move to contrast paints and shades. So the DARKOATH Flesh is the contrast paint I'm putting on his body everywhere. It's going to eliminate all that light. You saw how ghostly he kind of looked, and as soon as this hits that, it goes on top of all the flesh colors I've used so far. It makes a dirty looking skin effect, but it is somewhat transparent, so underneath it come the layers, and make sure you don't get any on his skull. We want to keep that nice and stark. Try not to get any on the pink of his muscles, because we're going to take care of those, but feel free to go over the bruises because they would be covered in skin, and it again starts to help blend all those bruising colors together. His legs as well need this flesh treatment, and I think this is the first time I've used DARKOATH on actual flesh. It's a very dirty look, I find, kind of like Big Chris, one of my giants, but it does give a good ogre color, I believe. Again, if I was going with a traditional zombie like the source material, he would be more white and pasty and pale, but because we're going with this, he was just alive 3 weeks ago and before he was cursed, this works well. Now while we're on the stage of that, I want to mention too, his base under his feet, that bubblegum chew that you see, sometimes I pop that off in my miniatures. It was not possible to pop this one off. He's printed onto that base, so unless you cut him off, which would ruin his toes, you're gonna have to deal with it, as I will when we get to the basing part of the video. So just in case you're wondering why I left it on, that's why. So now we're on to the volupus pink, volupus, I don't know, it's late, it's 1 o'clock. I'm going to put this pink on the pink horror undertones. Now I just picked this contrast paint up recently and I do like it. I think it's really neat how it covers. So you can see I'm putting it on the purple just a little bit. I also have 2 red contrast paints, which I think would have been too intense. They would have turned that pink horror into a red bloodbath. And while I am going to add gore later, I just want this pink to accentuate the fibers in the muscle and the details in the gore without washing them all out with this straight red, looking like it's a Bloody Mary or something. So as you can see, I'm putting it around his skull. I'm not painting it on the skull. I'm putting it around where the flesh was ripped off, and that's where I'm touching it. I'm dousing it in this hole and around the edge. You can see that abdomen hole. I put the brush in there, give it a swishy wishy just to get all the colors that I put in there all the same, and a little bit onto his tartan as well. So now VERMINLORD hide. This is a dry brush. I didn't mention that with my title, but I'm just putting it on his tuft here just to give it a little bit of detail. It could have gone either way, I'll be honest. Once all the gore is applied, all this dry brushing gets lost anyways. AGGAROS Dunes. Now this is the bandage color, so I want the bandage to look dirty, and the best way to do that is to take that gray sear and cover it with one of my favorite contrast paints, AGGAROS Dunes, because it turns them into like this white / yellow / brown dirty. Just looks gross, man. And once we put some gore effect on there to show the wounds coming through, it'll be awesome. Black Templar for the foot wraps, because I don't really know what's up with that. He's got like these feeties that have a fur around the top, but the bottom is like a monk foot wraps or a karate guy. So I'm like, what? Whatever. I'll just use black contrast paint, black Templar. Just it gives it like a deep gray with some good layering effect. And try not to touch the skin. Again, those aren't so much bandages. I saw them literally as his shoes. So, alright, time to do some basing. So I'm super glued them on there. I'm using some Stirland mud. Again, without being able to cut off that base, I'm going to have to build up around said base. I'm also using a 3-inch base instead of the 2-inch base that came with the model, and I did that on purpose. Remember, he's got this huge hole in his abdomen, and I want to capitalize on that with this concept I had of guts. Now, I did this before with my zombie T-Rex back in episode whatever the hell it was, but I did it after I glued the T-Rex to the base, which was pretty bad because now I had to work under his body. This one I was prepared for. So I build up the Stirland mud and a little bit on top of the chewing gum and push it up against the his base so that it kind of creates a little slope and basically hides the base he came with from anyone who's looking at it. I use a junker brush for this. Not sure if you have to see my tape around it that tells me it's a junker brush, but I'm pretty sure those technical paints have little teeny beads of plastic in them or something that's probably terrible for the environment. So I don't want to use my fine brushes and have that shit get all clogged up in the well of the brush. So I use junker brush for technical paints. So once that's built up, before it even dries, I'm going to go to this Gale Force 9 Arid Grass. I'm using my Gale Force 9 products I got from Kijiji. I was starting this. I didn't know what the base was going to be, but I knew it was going to be layered. So Arid Grass puts down a nice yellow, wheaty kind of look, but I wasn't planning to have him in a wheat field. I just wanted to have something other than brown underneath all the green. So we start with the Arid Grass and we move on to Spring Undergrowth. This goes on nicely. It looks like some Kush. Just put that on there nicely. And again, because the Stirland mud is still wet, it just, I'm tapping it on there with my finger and it's sticking. And that's good. You can still see some brown. You can still see the Arid Grass underneath. And once all this is on there and dried, I'm going to spray the whole thing with a sealer, like a semi-gloss spray. Not the model itself, just the base, to kind of lock in all this flocking that I'm doing here. So now we're on to the gore. So this paint is called Coagulated Blood from Green Stuff World. Now I know you all love Blood for the Blood God, and so do I, trust me. But Coagulated Blood, I used it before on my Diablo tribute, is like a Blood for the Blood God that you left out. It takes this brownish red hue, and it's still glossy, but it looks like blood that's been there for a while. It looks awesome. So you can see I'm putting a bit on his skull here around the pink edges. So I figured the top of the bone would be pretty clean. So I put it on lightly so it sinks to the edges and the top stays pretty clean. I put some on his, see that viscera, like on that fur, the back of his feet, on that Templar. I mean, he's been carting around these guts and he's stepping in them, so that black Templar contrast is going to have it. See the color on my wet palette there? See how gross that looks? It's like an orange, brown, red. See on the backs of his fingers, and everything this touches just looks so gross. So on his bruises, on the back of his hands, on his bandages, it's perfect. Great job, Green Stuff World, great paint color. Now we're on to Blood for the Blood God. I tried to do a little bit of a splatter effect. It didn't work very well. I think I screwed it up. But a little bit it got on there. It's noticeable up close. Now I wanted to put some on this because he is still kicking ass and taking names, because he's an unstoppable undead. He's got this stone club and he's obviously just bashed the shit out of something. And now I'm going to touch on top of my coagulated blood, not too much, because it should look dirty and brown, but some areas should be fresh blood too. So I'm touching. Now it's time for the guts. This is fun. Clear hot glue. Put a little dab inside for a stomach or an organ or whatever that you think that is. Use your imagination. There's just a lump of glue in there. Use my knife, actually those were little snips. I had to snip off the top. Now I'm just drizzling a little bit out. Again, those little strands are a pain in the ass, but you go slow, let it dry. Do it in waves. Don't do it all at once, or the definition of gut you're trying to achieve will get melded together as the hot glue just melts on top of itself. So you can see here, now I'm starting to put some outside onto his tartan. Just a little, looks like a wiener hanging out there of glue. And we're going to color the glue later. It paints well. Alright, so now we've got the start. Now we're going to go from the bottom up to the top. And I'm spinning it to try and keep it, you know, you don't want gravity to pull it down and have it be a big like pear shape, and you don't want it to snap off, so you kind of have to play with it. And a little strand is all you need, because when it dries you're going to put another strand on top of the first strand. So the first strand I did there, I'm going to put another one on top, and maybe even another one after that. This is fun, you should just enjoy it. So here's another one on the ground, on the base, heading backwards like a big slime noodle, like he's being followed by a snail. And see, I put another one on top a little too early, and then it melded together and it got a bigger slime trail, and I was like, dang, should I start again? Nope. Happy accidents, people. Plus, remember, all that flocking I have on there would potentially get wrecked. So here I am with pink horror, applying it to not all, but some of this stuff. So some of it's going to be pink, some of it's going to be the purples that I used earlier, some of it's going to be a brown, a Nightquester flesh with an AGGAROS dunes, because again, guts aren't all pink and yellow. What? Yellow? Really? Guts are not all pink and purple. As you can see, I started pink because that looks disgusting. It looks like a big tongue following him. And that's just a big lump of glue. So I started with the pink, and then I'm not going to layer it, but I'm just going to paint with the purple on the other side of the pink. There's another little drop I did of AGGAROS dunes. So I did another layer of intestine on top of the first one. You can see I snaked it on top, and they're two different colors. So one looks like large intestine, one looks like small, whatever. So now I'm hitting back. It looks like I'm back to my VOLUPUS pink contrast paint on top of the pink horror that I've just used to make them turn a little bit more in line with the guts in his stomach. Okay, and now some more coagulated blood on the ground, around, on the flock. Drops. It's going to soak up, it's going to look messy. That's okay, because this is and I'm using my technical brush there to just try and push it around a little bit. It's not going to move very well, but this is what happens when blood gets dripped on grass. It turns into a big brown spot, and that's okay. So here I am now starting to fix some basing. I didn't film much of the basing. You guys can have fun with the basing. I had some little tufts. I had a piece of wood there. I put some grapevine. That looks really cool when it's dried. There's some moss I'm putting on this little log. Again, basing is the best and easiest part of the miniature project. Just run with it. Get a lot of that shit outside in your own house. Then they also have the hobby store stuff. But let's take a look at the finished product, shall we? So here he is. See my finished base there. Those guts hanging out. You can still see the details of his abdomen rip. Very cool. I put white on his eye as well as some gray. There's the Dremel for the skull. I think that skull looks legit. The hole is kind of full of guts there, but they're there, especially in real life. Those are the grapevines I was just telling you about on the base. See how the bruising finished when everything was said and done? That pink on top looks very hot. Those bandages got that dirty / bloody look because of the coagulated blood. And again, the top of his head looks sick. Here he is again. So folks, that's it for the Ogre Zombie. And that looks like guts hanging out. Looks great. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, paintalife@gmail.com, or in the comments below in this video, and I will answer them for you. That's all for tonight. I'm GMA Tank. Hope you enjoyed. We'll talk to you later.